Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to a celebration of the life of Zeke Grader. Today, the program will consist of my opening remarks, which will be followed by comments made from his family and colleagues and friends. Zeke established the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations in 1976 after many encounters with the commercial fishing in the family business, fishery law, and a passion for sustaining the culture of commercial fishing. My relationship with Zeke started with my role as president of the Federation from 1992 to 2004. It continued until his passing on September the 7th, Labor Day. It is a commemorating coincidence that Zeke's death was on Labor Day, a day that is devoted to workers. In Zeke's life, the workers are commercial fishermen who are the prime examples of labor and take their pride of their occupation as a labor of love. Zeke's mission was to advocate for the commercial fishermen. He did this by highlighting the importance of marine resources and coastal communities. Threats to marine resources were threats to commercial fishermen. Abundant fish stocks was what Zeke strived for in his advocacy. Whether it was offshore oil activity, or water diversion, or ocean pollution, or dams, Zeke was able to confront these issues with authority and knowledge. He had a special skill of working with a very broad group of legislators, people, and organizations. His work reached out globally and nationally. In 1997, he was instrumental in forming a global organization, the World Fisheries Forum in New Delhi, India. In 2009, he led the way for a national organization of commercial fishermen, the Commercial Fishermen of America. Zeke gave human values to fish, to fishery habitat, to ecosystems, to oceans. His vision was embedded in his lifelong quest for teaching others the ecological, social, and economic importance of sustaining domestic fisheries. He was a true educator and legend. Zeke had a very convincing message about how to catch fish. Having grown up in the family business of salmon in Fort Bragg, he used a subtle piece of ornament on his clothing to remind us of the simplicity of the method of catching salmon with a hook. Whenever Zeke would dress with a tie, he used a hook as his tie clasp. When someone saw this tie clasp on Zeke, one was convinced that Zeke meant business, and his business was done using hooks. It was a very strong message. And now I'd like to bring on his brother, Sam Grader. Thank you.
So I thought I would talk about what it was like growing up with Zeke. Because he was 5 years older than me, Zeke was always in my life. As long as I can remember, Zeke was there, and I used to tag along behind Zeke and his buddies exploring Fort Bragg and the docks of the Noyle River. To understand Zeke and what shaped him, you need to know where he came from. When we were growing up in Fort Bragg in the 50s and 60s, it was a much different town than it is today. Back then, most of the men worked either in the mills, or they worked in the woods, logging redwoods and Douglas fir, or they worked in the fishing business, either as fishermen or on the docks. Fort Bragg back then was a town of about 5,000, and it was made up of largely immigrants or second-generation people from Italy, Portugal, Finland, and many of those people were fishermen. It was a blue-collar town where men took pride in how hard they worked. And people looked up to the guys who were the good loggers and especially the good fishermen. Our parents owned a fish processing plant, which was called Grader Fish Company. We just called it the Fish House. When we were growing up, there were about 6 or 7 fish houses on Noyle River. Most of them were owned by Italian families, the Aliotos, the Tarantinos, the Paladinis, the Kaitos, the Bagatos, except for our fish house. We were sort of the outlier. During salmon season, there would be boats from as far south as Morro Bay and as far north as Seattle. Sometimes during the salmon season, you could literally walk across the river on the boats. And I know some of the fellows who are fishermen can remember that. Noyle back then was a really busy port, and there was a lot of things for young boys to do. We played on the docks, we played under the docks. We jigged for herring, we fished for perch. We played on the river in rowboats. We watched the fillet ladies fillet sole and rockfish. We learned some pretty salty language back then from the fishermen and from the fillet ladies. When it was slow, we would go to a little cafe across the street from our fish house called Snug Harbor. And we would watch the Portuguese fishermen play pinochle, and we would listen to the fishermen tell stories. When we were old enough, which was about 12, our parents put us to work in the fish house. Work started at 8 a.m. and did not finish until the last boat had unloaded and all the fish were taken care of. This generally meant that we worked until 9 p.m. and sometimes later, and this was 7 days a week, all summer long. An average work week was 70 to 80 hours or more. I'm sure Richard Amoson's here. He can remember working 100-hour weeks. I often wonder how our parents, who were good liberal Democrats, justified the number of hours we worked compared to the child labor laws. I'm sure that our parents did this to keep us out of trouble, and which worked until work ended. And for those of you who have wondered what Zeke was like in his youth, I can say that he was mischievous. He was. The best years of my life were spent growing up and working at Noyle Harbor, and I think that Zeke probably felt the same way. It was truly a magical time and place. This background gave Zeke his love for the traditional fishing business and the small fisherman who was able to make a living and provide for his family. Zeke also admired the immigrant fishermen, whether it be Portuguese, Italian, Finn, who through hard work, good honest hard work, was able to provide for his family. Zeke grew up loving causes. He always had a cause growing up, whether it was the free speech movement at Berkeley, the civil rights movement, or later the anti-war movement. My heroes were Mays, McCovey, Marichal, Cepeda. Zeke's heroes were Mario Savio, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Julian Bond, Malcolm X, Norman Thomas, and for those of you who don't remember, he was like the Bernie Sanders of that generation, and Eugene McCarthy. Later his cause was the environment, and he was able to mesh his love of the traditional fishing business with the environmental movement, because he realized that for there to be a fishing industry in the future, we needed to take care of the environment now. Zeke also loved cars, and this may seem to be an unusual segue from talking about the environment to cars, but back then, all the guys Zeke's age and older loved cars. When he was about 13, Zeke and his pals built a I don't know what to call it. I guess you call it a soapbox derby type of car, but it was a large car. It had a metal frame and everything. And their plan was to race it down a steep hill near our house. And they were successful, except that they forgot to plan for brakes. And the car went down the hill very fast, across the road, through a fence, and into a house. And they had to spend a little bit of time paying for the damage they had done. They also learned at about age 14 how to hotwire cars. And it seemed that whenever we would come home from trips and Zeke was left home alone, there would always be wires dangling down from beneath the steering wheels. And I remember on one occasion he tried to blame me for those wires hanging down beneath the steering wheel. But anybody who knows me knows it would have been impossible for me to hotwire a car. But going back to the story about the car that they built, Zeke never knew what the hell brakes were for. And I think that was a theme that was throughout his life. He never knew what brakes were for. He never slowed down. Now I want to just say a few things about Zeke's final days. We visited him several times a week while he was in hospice. He was always upbeat and never felt sorry for himself. He kept working to the end. He never complained. He always wanted to know what was going on in our lives. We had bought a house in Fort Bragg. He wanted to know what was going on with the house. He always wanted to know what was going on with his nephews and his grandnephews, of which he has 2 now. And Zeke faced his final days with dignity and courage. So in conclusion, I want to thank Zeke for letting me hang out with him and his buddies when I was just a kid, for buying me baseball cards, for giving me an appreciation of folk music and his favorites, Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan, at least until Dylan went electric in '65, for taking me to the Lutheran Church when I was a kid because all of his Finnish buddies went there, for taking me to the Fillmore Auditorium when I was 14 to see Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. I'm sure that our parents would not have approved of him doing that, but he did. For giving me an appreciation of beer at a far too early age. For trying to make me appreciate the Indianapolis 500 and other car races, but sorry, Zeke, I just didn't get it. And finally, for standing up. For standing up for what was right, whether it be the civil rights, the environment, or most importantly, protecting and saving the wild salmon. Thank you.
My name is Zeke Grader, and I'm Zeke's nephew, and I'd just like to share a couple of stories about Zeke. I got the opportunity several years back to work for Zeke for a couple of years before I started law school. And it was during that time that I got to tag along with Zeke and see what he does and how he operated. And it was a pretty interesting experience. Zeke, the thing that really impressed me most about Zeke is really how effective he was as an advocate. And I know I'm kind of a biased source, so I have an example. And there was one time when I was working for him that a representative from a local union came to one of Zeke's PCFFA meetings, and he explained the reason he wanted to attend was that he had been following Zeke for several years. I'd been really impressed by the amount of things that they'd been able to accomplish. I mean, the way he expressed it was that here's this tiny, or this small commercial fishing organization, and they're punching way above their weight and able to accomplish all these things that that they were able to do. And I think he basically just wanted to learn a couple of Zeke's tricks and see how he was able to do this. Additionally, I think when I was working for Zeke, I really saw how he was able to tailor his message to different audiences, because he testified before Congress, before the state legislature. He was advocating before state agencies, and he would attend academic conferences. And he was and he talked to a lot of journalists who were calling him when there was news in the fisheries. Zeke was always out there. And anybody who had ever read any of his quotes in the paper knew that Zeke really liked to give a witty quote, and he was really good at it. And one time I spoke with a reporter who told me how much that this reporter really liked to get his quotes from Zeke, because Zeke just gave the best quotes and the most interesting ones. And I think, as my dad had alluded to, Zeke had this mischievous side to his character, and I think when he spoke with journalists, it really kind of came through, because he really liked to kind of stir the pot a little bit, and that really came through in a lot of the things that you would read in the paper from Zeke. One other story I'd like to mention is that I remember, and this was just a different forum that we had gone to. It was we had gone down to Long Beach to the Aquarium of the Pacific, and to attend a conference on offshore aquaculture. And in the opening session of this conference, the plenary session, I think the topic was something like the regulatory environment for offshore aquaculture in California. And everybody in this auditorium, most of them were representatives from fish farming companies or scientists who were involved with promoting the development of aquaculture. And very quickly, the tone of this the plenary session became just these fish farming representatives just complaining about how onerous the regulations in California were for offshore aquaculture. And we were, it was just me and Zeke, and we were pretty outnumbered in this auditorium, and Zeke was unfazed. He just got up and rebutted these criticisms point by point, because I'm fairly certain Zeke probably had a role in establishing those regulations to begin with. And he was having none of it, and he was just making very clear, concise points. He wasn't strident in any way, and he was just a really, it was so clear how effective he was. And so finally, after Zeke passed, I was able to hear from people who we knew mutually, and some people emailed me condolences and expressed how Zeke had either been a hero to them or had really inspired them in something they had done. And also, I got the opportunity to hear from people who had been on the opposing side of issues with Zeke, and they also expressed a real deep respect for Zeke as like a gentleman and somebody who really strove to understand the other side of issues and understand where somebody was coming from. And so that was really moving to see that he had the admiration of people who were like-minded and the respect of people who opposed him in many things that he did. So I think Zeke has really left a great legacy. Our family is very proud of what he had done, and we're going to miss him a lot. Thank you.
My name is Andy Grader, and I'm Zeke's nephew. I'm honored to be able to say a few words about him today. When I think about Zeke, a famous quote comes to mind. I'm sure you've all heard it. Find a job that you love, and you never work a day in your life. Anyone as passionate about something as he was about protecting our oceans, rivers, and streams, and the marine life and fish that live in them. As you all know, this was his life calling. He ate, breathed, and slept this mission. He loved so much what he did. In fact, one of my last memories of him was helping Lois set up the new iPad in the hospice house so that he could continue working, which he did until he was physically unable to do so. Some of my fondest memories of Zeke are from holidays spent in Fort Bragg. My brothers and I would always wait for Zeke and Lois to arrive with our cousins, Zachary, Scarlett, or Emily. And yes, they were our cousins. Zeke always brought two things to Fort Bragg: cold beer and fresh crab. Growing up, what more could high school kids want? We would gather around the table, and Zeke, being the great storyteller with the infectious laugh, would immediately entertain. Each Christmas, I would always ask Zeke if he had received his yearly Christmas card from Sean Hannity. Year after year, it continued to get lost in the mail. Who knows, maybe this year it'll show up, so we'll have to ask Lois. This Thanksgiving, the family will all be in Fort Bragg, and I can't wait to drink cold beer and eat fresh crab and tell stories about Zeke. Many of you were at his retirement party back in April. That was such a special evening for Zeke and the rest of our family. It was amazing to get the chance to meet and hear from so many people whose lives have been impacted by him. The love and admiration was truly felt that night. Thank you all for being there and sharing your stories. I know that his legacy will live on through all of you here. Speaking of legacies, I have two sons, Cole Samuel, who is almost 3, and Bo William, who is 6 months. Zeke loved getting the chance to see my boys. Last Thanksgiving, we surprised Zeke with having my oldest son wear his old University of Washington varsity sweater he had from his childhood. And today, Bo, my youngest son, is wearing that sweater that Zeke his Letterman jacket, and there's a picture that family loves of Zeke as a 2-year-old wearing that jacket, same jacket. So it's obviously a special jacket for our family. Zeke later joked, he's like, "Oh, now I know where to get rid of all my clothes. Where all my clothes are going." It's my 2 boys, so it's pretty cool. I'm thankful for the time that they did have with him. I look forward to the days I can tell them about their great uncle Zeke. I can only hope those stories inspire them to live life as he did. We all miss you, Zeke, and your legacy will live on. There are those in this room who will continue your fight, and those who will continue to entertain by storytelling over cold beer and fresh crab. Thank you for all being here and allowing me the time to speak about Zeke, a man I will never forget. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Madeline. I'm Zeke's niece. My mom is his younger sister, Allison. Zeke was such an amazing, dynamic person. I know we all had our own special, unique relationship with him, and I just want to talk a little bit about mine. Growing up, I didn't really fully appreciate what Zeke did or the impact of his work. You know, he was just my uncle who liked fish the way someone might like baseball or opera. What I think about when I think about Zeke growing up is his enthusiasm. Without fail, he'd greet me with a "How you doing, kid?" and he'd just be so positive. And that warmth was something that, you know, stayed with him through the years till the very end, you know, talking in his final days. That's how he'd greet me, and I'm sure everyone in here received greetings of similar enthusiasm. I grew up on the East Coast, so, you know, I'd get to see Zeke maybe once a year. Sometimes it was every 2 years, but the time and the distance definitely didn't diminish anything in our relationship. I've got wonderful memories of visiting Zeke and Lois here in California, particularly in Calistoga. The whole family would get together at their ranch out there in Calistoga and just have a wonderful time. And you could see how important it was for Zeke to be with his family and be surrounded by the people he loved. And just, warm and positive the whole time. He would often come out to the East Coast, and again, as a kid, I didn't really appreciate that he was going to DC to do this really important work. But what I always got a sense of was this forward momentum with Zeke. There was work to be done, and he was really excited to do that. And, when you're young and you think of grown-ups, it's sort of like, oh, you become an adult and you do your work, and it's not something that you often see people pursuing with such vigor and enthusiasm. So, as I became an adult myself and began working, that's when I really started to appreciate his truly remarkable passion, uncommon, to see something like that and to see the scope of his work as well. It's something that I think inspires all of us, and something that if we take anything away from what is too early of a passing, is that to harness that and to maybe try to incorporate that into our own lives, to live with passion. So a couple of years ago, I was out visiting, and we were having dinner, Zeke and I and my husband and Emily. Again, everybody knows Emily. She was there with us too. We were at a restaurant so she could be sitting with us outside, and we were talking about his work. And, I asked him, do you ever plan to retire? And, not skipping a beat, he said, there's too much work to be done. And so to me, that's, something that makes it harder, because Zeke was somebody who was willing to keep working and wanted to do it. And these coasts have lost a great advocate. The people who work in these waters have lost a great advocate, but we all have too, because if you know Zeke, he was a cheerleader for everybody that was in his life. He wanted to, I'm a teacher, he always wanted to know about what was going on with my students. And just the support he gave to everybody, it will be greatly missed. And I think everybody in here has their own memory of being cheered on by Zeke in that unique way. And that's what I have to say about my Uncle Zeke. I'm sorry, it's hard for me to speak. Thank you.
Good day, I'm Ed Huber. I'm a friend of Zeke's, and I have the honor to introduce another friend of Zeke's. And like Zeke, this gentleman cares about the ocean, he cares about the fishermen, and he cares about our country. The only thing is, he probably gets more pleasure out of fishing than he does with his current job, but he's willing to work for all of us. So I'd like to introduce to you Congressman Jared Huffman.
Hi folks, I'm Zeke's Congressman, Jared Huffman, and most of the big things that really need to be said about Zeke were said back in April when we had a wonderful living tribute that Zeke could actually attend. What a great idea that was, and I got to present a congressional record statement, what members of Congress do to recognize great people and their contributions to our country. What was unique about the congressional record statement we made for Zeke Grader is it wasn't just from me as his congressman. It was from 4 members of Congress, myself, Nancy Pelosi, Jackie Spear, and Mike Thompson, plus there was a separate tribute from recently retired Congressman George Miller. That kind of broad congressional accolade is almost unheard of, but I think it speaks to the kind of congressional fan club that Zeke Grader had. I was also invited to speak at that tribute event in April. And I pulled together the best Zeke Grader material that I had. I built a speech largely around a 2009 appearance that Zeke made on Fox News. Sean Hannity had put together this 5-part series in the previous drought that was attempting to blame all of the San Joaquin Valley's problems on the Endangered Species Act and a little fish called the Delta smelt. And Zeke Grader was the token environmentalist that he invited onto the show to be interviewed and really crucified. So I kind of built the speech around that as Zeke took on Sean Hannity and frankly kicked his ass. I would tell you all about it, but I already did back in April. So, I really worked very hard on that speech. It was the best speech I could make. It had structure, it was witty, it was as good as I can do. The only problem was I don't think Zeke heard a word of it, because he was so swarmed by friends and fans and family who were hugging him and taking selfies and telling old war stories, that my great speech that I had worked on was really just background noise that night. And you know what? I'm glad, because as much as I loved writing that speech and giving it, because for me, it captured the essence of some of Zeke's greatness, what was really important that night in that hugely crowded room at the Bay Model in Sausalito was for Zeke to feel the love of all the people there. And I know that he did, and I know that he continued to feel it all the way to the end, with a steady stream of family and friends checking on him and attending to him during his time in hospice. What impressed me, but really didn't surprise me, was how he wanted to keep working right up to the end, even when his health declined. He wanted to pass on every little bit of knowledge, of insights, of history, of strategic advice to all the folks that he knew were going to carry on his work. And I kept getting reports of Zeke working on this project or that. In his final couple of weeks, Zeke dictated to me and my staff what I think is the definitive work on hatchery fish marking. We got it in our file, and it will forever guide our consideration of the pros and cons of hatchery fish marking. But that's just one example of how Zeke had his shoulder to the wheel all the way to the end. It speaks a lot to who he was. When I finally spoke to him by phone in those final weeks, he didn't really want to have a mushy conversation of any kind. He wanted to talk about drought legislation. What was Feinstein up to? What were we going to do to stop Westlands? These were the kind of things that Zeke pressed me on. And normally when someone is in hospice, you don't ask them to do stuff for you. But I had this feeling that Zeke really wanted to keep doing things. And so my very last interaction with Zeke involved something we needed him to do. As luck would have it, we had won a big court victory over the Westlands Water District. They were trying to steal some water from my Trinity River, from our wild salmon in the Trinity and Klamath River system, who desperately needed some flows from the Bureau of Reclamation to avoid a massive fish kill along the lines of what we saw tragically in 2002. Westlands tried to stop the federal government from releasing cold water from Trinity Dam. We prevailed in federal court to get those flows released for the fish. And I had to do a press release on this big win. And that's something, Zeke's nephew spoke to this just a few moments ago, that Zeke was so good at. And so it really wouldn't be right to do a press release like this without a quote from the go-to guy, our iconic spokesperson for wild salmon, Zeke Grader. So I reached out to him in hospice, and he did what he has done hundreds, probably thousands of times before. He cranked out one of those zinger quotes about salmon and fishermen and greedy Westlands farmers. Truth be told, it was so hard-hitting we actually had to tone it down. I think the original draft was something about letting the west side of the valley revert to nature's plan, a desert. So, just a little over the top. But we calibrated it, got it just right, and it was really special to work with Zeke in those final days on something like that. I don't want to suggest by talking about Zeke's work ethic right to the end that he was one-dimensional, because he wasn't. He was much more than an advocate for fish and fishermen, as his family and close friends have attested already. To all of us, he was also a warm and funny and classy human being. That's why he had so many friends and admirers. That's why his advocacy was so effective and enduring. And that's why even his opponents respected him greatly. So we're going to miss Zeke for lots of reasons. Just a couple days ago, as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Water, Power, and Oceans, I had a chance to be part of a hearing on a bill involving the Gulf of Mexico red snapper. I'm going a little far afield, folks, so bear with me here. But anyway, the red snapper was badly overfished a few decades ago, lack of any kind of cohesive management. And the Magnuson-Stevens Act came along and put in place some rebuilding goals and some quotas and some structure to a plan that would bring that fishery back for both commercial, for charter boats, and for recreational interests. It's been very carefully managed for the last few years, and it's coming back. It's about halfway to the rebuilding goal under the Magnuson Act. And some Louisiana sports fishermen have decided that it's doing good enough. We ought to just relax all the rules and let everybody start hammering these fish again. And so there I was in this hearing on this wrong-headed proposal. And I was just thinking what Zeke Grader would say this week. These guys want to take an off-ramp when you're halfway through a rebuilding goal. They want to put at risk a commercially valuable fishery and the success that we're going to see from commercial fishermen and charter boats. This is crazy. You got to stop them. I was literally thinking that Zeke would be telling me that, and I think we will stop that bill. But it's great to have Zeke's voice in my head as we continue to work on these issues. I've often said in my political campaigns that fish can't vote, and so we need to work extra hard to make sure a lot of people vote for them. Fish can't speak at memorial services either. But I think that if the salmon and rockfish and smelt and Dungeness crab and other aquatic creatures of the Pacific coast could speak, they would say thank you, Zeke Grader. And thank you to Lois and Zeke's mom and his family for sharing him with the world.
Thank you, Congressman, for those words of inspiration. I know for a fact that Zeke values the support and encouragement that you have given him throughout his career. Now I would like to read a letter from Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, who unfortunately could not attend this memorial event, but her relationship with Zeke and the Federation go back decades. She is an example of how people will support the marine resources, of how people will support legislation that will benefit the bounty of the seas and the knowledge that fishermen have and can share with many other people. Dear family and friends of Zeke Grader, William Zeke Grader Jr.'s life served as a beacon of hope for all who value our environment, our communities, and the beauty of God's creation. I wish I could be with Lois and all of you today to celebrate this magnificent man and to honor his extraordinary contributions to our beautiful San Francisco Bay Area. Zeke's determination and vision made change in our world. He was a community activist whose service as an intellectual resource, motivator, and mobilizer united our community and helped preserve our environment for the future. Zeke was a tremendous leader for conservationists seeking to preserve the balance in our ecosystem over the years. Because of Zeke's leadership, the wild, majestic California coast we so enjoy will be preserved for future generations. Because of his fierce advocacy, our Pacific Coast fisheries and historic commercial fishing industry will remain vibrant. He has left an inspiring, living legacy to our community and our world. I am very blessed to have called Zeke a cherished friend for many years and hope it is a comfort to Lois and his entire family that so many people love and admire Zeke and mourn their loss. It is a wonderful tribute to Zeke that you are taking the time to recognize an extraordinary leader and a dear friend, Zeke Grader. Warmest personal regards, Nancy Pelosi, Democratic leader. So now I'd like to introduce Louise DEDERA, who is Zeke's cousin.
Thanks, Pietro. I am Louise Sturgis DEDERA, and Lois is Sturgis through her grandmother, and there are a number of Sturgis cousins here today. And when that family came out from Connecticut to California, they came to take care of their interests in the Comstock lode. And Lois's uncle Dwight was the assayer, and our grandfather was the mine superintendent. When Lois first introduced us to her husband, Zeke, they had a dog named Zach, another Cocker Spaniel. And it took us a while to quit calling the dog Zeke. We saw them regularly at family gatherings, like my Aunt Marion's 90th, or Aunt Jean's 90th, or memorials, and so on. We drove up to the ranch one time when they had just built a new Japanese tea house, and typically we sat around and talked, and Zeke cooked. Our granddaughters, when they were 3 and 5, lived in Los Gatos and put on a animal show, stuffed animal show for us. But more often they would come down to our backyard and we would have picnic lunches out there, and I always served salmon, wild salmon, and I'm sure that Zeke thought we ate nothing but wild salmon. When we got together, Lois and I would launch into a Sturgis family history. And that was really interesting to us and not to anybody else. And one time I saw Zeke sitting there very quietly, and I said, Zeke, you probably had interesting people in your family too. And he said, yes, my grandfather was a bootlegger. I said, what? Okay, so we now knew that this was a fun cousin, and a cousin who had his own stories to tell. So we always wanted to visit them at Thanksgiving, but we have discovered today that they have other family, and they always went up to see his mom in Fort Bragg. And apparently all the rest of the family was there too. But we saw Zeke on TV. Some years we saw him more on TV than in person. And he was always representing the fishing industry. But it wasn't until Pietro, who just read Nancy's letter, talked to me at the Menlo Park Farmers Market, where I always bought fish, that most people really didn't know how hard Zeke worked for that industry. And we didn't know, the family didn't know, and it wasn't until we found out he had pancreatic cancer, and then we had the 2 wonderful events at the Bay Model, that we got to know our cousin even better. So Lois, of course, was conflicted in wanting his suffering to end, and then knowing how hard it would be when that suffering did end. And so, Lois, your family's full of gratitude to you for dropping this wonderful man among us. I mean, look at his chin. You know, he was a man that knew what he wanted to do, and no matter how hard it was, he figured out a way to make it happen. So thank you, Lois.
My name is Jonathan ESTOK. I'm going to be reading a letter from my mother, who is unable to be here today, but she wanted me to read this, and then I've got some own words for myself as well. So from my mother, I'm sorry that I cannot be here today with Lois and you to celebrate Zeke's life. I was here in April 2015 to be witness to the many people who spoke to honor Zeke's many accomplishments, his advocacy for the environment and the fishing industry at the Bay Institute Awards event. I'm cousin of Lois, and we've shared many events together. I'd like to tell you one short story that exemplified how loving and caring person Zeke was. At one such visit to Connecticut, Lois and Zeke went to a shopping mall, and as they walked past this pet store, they fell in love with a beautiful puppy Cocker Spaniel. Actually, I noticed the picture up there is of that Cocker Spaniel. Her name was Miss Scarlet. They loved her, and she was part of the family. Zeke spent many hours working and did not want her to be alone, so she ended up taking him to work all the time. A San Francisco newspaper did a feature on professionals who brought their pets to work, and Zeke and Scarlet were spotlighted. Zeke loved and cared for all living creatures and the environment. When you spoke to him, he gave his full attention. He would then give his opinion in a firm but caring voice. We truly miss his wisdom, firm handshake, amazing smile, and distinctive laugh. Zeke, we love you and we'll miss you. Love, Debbie ESTOK. I read an article by a psychologist a little while ago that explained as we got older why time seemed to speed up. As it goes, when we're 10, a year is 1/10 of the total time we've been alive. Yet, in contrast, when we're 50, a year is only 1/50th of that time. The brain perceives this as time passing by quicker, and as each year it continues to add up. In this modern digital world, we have more ways to communicate than ever. It seems the workday has been extended well beyond 8 hours, and Zeke knew that better than all of us. When tragedy strikes, though, it's when we stop and we realize how much time has passed, this moment of lucidity and clarity. As we gather here today to honor a man who has given so much to so many, a man who has dedicated his life to others, to the service of others, and so accomplished, and who has touched so many lives, I think Zeke would want us to take a moment and reflect on our own lives. For in a few short hours, we'll be once again caught up in the daily grind, when time will start to speed up for us once again, and before we know it, it'll pass us by. Life is truly way too short, and with the passing of Zeke, we have lost an incredible man. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eddie Grader, and I'm Zeke's nephew. First, I wanted to thank Lois, my aunt, for allowing me to say a few words about my Uncle Zeke. Over the past few weeks, I've been reflecting and thinking about the times I've spent with my uncle, and some of my fondest memories of him are from when I was a kid. He was always that cool uncle, kind of an older brother-like, that you always wanted to be around. He would always call me Champ, and as a kid, I loved it. Of course, he called my brothers Champ too, but whatever, I didn't care. Zeke was also a great storyteller, as you have all heard. He could talk about anything, from the fish house to politics to food, you name it. And you better believe I learned the difference between farm-raised and wild salmon pretty early on. When I was 16, I had this 1986 stick shift BMW. It was my first car, and Zeke wanted to take it for a spin. So I asked him, "Do you know how to drive stick shift?" And he kind of, it was a dumb question. Needless to say, for the next hour or so, I got a grill in on cars. In early 2009, I had the pleasure of being with Zeke during a very happy moment in his life. It was the end of the Bush administration. Zeke was in San Diego for a conference, and after he was done, I met up with him and a couple of his colleagues for dinner. We all watched President Obama get inaugurated that night on my computer at dinner. Obviously, Zeke was thrilled. I always thought it was pretty cool that I got to witness that. One thing I always admired about Zeke was his passion for his work, like everyone else has said. His work wasn't a job, and obviously if he were around today, he would still be hard at work. Over the last year, even in the face of adversity, Zeke continued to be his positive, enthusiastic self. Whenever my wife and I called or visited him, he was always excited to see us and always wanted to hear about what we were up to. So I'll definitely miss those conversations. Lois, you're the strongest woman I know, and I know we are all going to miss him, and thank you.
Hi, I'm Bill KIER. Thanks, Lois, for inviting me. I've been trying to think through what I want to say about Zeke, and I've been caught up in the notion that Zeke is so much an extension of his dad. William F. Grader Sr., that I want to kind of give you the context of the two William Grader generations. I met William F. Grader Sr., Bill Grader, when he agreed to come over to Sacramento to be the deputy administrator of the brand new State Resources Agency in 1964. And I met William F. Grader Jr., Zeke, that December when Bill brought the family over for a holiday gathering of Pat Brown administration cronies. Zeke would have been in high school at the time. And I was a budding bureaucrat with a passion for natural resources policy. What happened over the next 50 years was an increasing intertwining of our two families. Bill Grader handed me daily assignments at the Resources Agency, and when I went to work for the State Senate in 1967, he immediately appeared on my office doorstep and began giving me assignments for his ideas about salmon conservation and river conservation and forest and coastline conservation. And Bill's ideas were so brilliant that it made me look really good when I just wrote them up, and advanced my career enormously. And on those trips to Sacramento that Bill Grader made, I would often take him home for dinner. And so while we were fixing dinner, setting the table or whatever, and chatting, having a drink, we were often joined by our youngest, Mary Claire. We have 3 kids. Rob, who's in the audience, who for years we never really knew where Rob was. Catherine was always in her room writing in her diary, and thank you, sir. Writing in her diary and strumming on her guitar, so we knew where she was. Mary Claire, the youngest, was usually in the mix with me and Helen and Bill Grader, entertaining Bill with stories about what was happening in her 9-year-old life. And Bill loved Mary Claire because she was such a total busy butt and was always organizing people and things and so forth. And that's the stuff that Bill lived for. When the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations was launched then in 1976 with Zeke as its lobbyist, Zeke immediately appeared on my office doorstep in the Capitol, and he would say, right down to the end, he and I, by the way, did a oral history, the second one we've done this year, on the 19th of August. It's kind of a digression, but he called to ask if I would come into the Zen Hospice project to do an oral history, and I was on a ton of deadlines, and I said, I can't make it Wednesday. Could we make it a week from Wednesday? And he said, I don't think that's going to work well for me. I mean, he was hours from the end when we did a couple of hours of oral history that I understand is heading for the Library of Congress, so I'm pleased for that. But Zeke had And I just want to explain what really bound me with these two William Graders was that I shared their passion for conservation of California's wonderful resources. And I'm of the era when nobody gave a rat's about tree huggers or posy pluckers. And what I saw as a young bureaucrat was legislators just turning themselves inside out to help small business, to help mom and pop businesses. And the fishing families are the essential small businesses, the mom and pop businesses. So I thought, yeah, that's where we're going to sell what was my agenda, which was Bill Grader's agenda, which was Zeke's agenda. So Zeke left a job of managing the family's fish dock in Sausalito, the Ocean Traders dock, foot of Spring Street, to take this PCFFA lobbying and executive head job. And soon thereafter, my son Rob, raise your hand, there you go, went to work for Bill and Jerry Grader at the fish house up in Fort Bragg, and pivoted soon after that down to Sausalito to become the manager of the family's Ocean Traders dock. I exited the state senate sort of on the end of their boot toe. I was canned in early 1983 for being too environmental for the new leadership there, which was being steered by a pack of lobbyists. And Helen and I, there's Helen. Helen and I had a 3-year misadventure as innkeepers up in the Sierra before we migrated to Southern Marin. As soon as we moved to Southern Marin and connected with Zeke, we just picked it up exactly where we left it. Within months, Zeke had sweet-talked Helen into coming to work for him at PCFFA, which in those days was headquartered in Sausalito. Helen would stay with PCFFA for another 13 years. Zeke valued her strongest talent, which was keeping people happy on the telephone. With the advent of cell phones, one of Zeke's burdens became fishermen who were simply out there on the water fishing and wanting to talk to him about this regulation or this problem or this guy or whatever. And so Helen's job was to just keep chatting them while Zeke was getting his work done. So there you have it. The Grader and KIER family friendship wasn't just about business, and it wasn't just about politics. It was about involved a whole lot of fun and mutual love and respect for one another, and for the California that we all wanted, with healthy rivers and forests and productive coastal ocean waters. And I was ruminating with Mary Claire, our youngest, who was visiting us last weekend, about how I was really going to drive this thesis of mine home with you guys. And she said, she said, you could point out that I named my firstborn Noah Ezekiel just so I could call him Zeke. And I guess tributes don't get much more loving or sincere than that, do they? Thanks.
PCFA at that time representing Southern, which is a diverse, different fishery than Central and Northern California. I kept sitting up here today looking at that picture of Zeke. I've seen that look a lot of times on his face. One time that he had that look, the wheels are turning behind those eyes. They're not stopped if you watch. We had a big sport fishing association in California. The president was causing all kinds of problems with the fishermen down there and the different fisheries, passing ballot initiatives, closing them down. And I came and told Zeke, and Zeke said, well, don't worry, Mike. He gave me that look right there and said, we'll take care of that. Pretty soon that president of that association would come to me at a different council meeting or a meeting and say, I'm really jealous of Zeke. Every time he gets up, everybody listens. And when I get up, people don't listen to me. You know why? I told them, you're always telling mistruths and lies. Zeke always tells the truth. That's why he has respect. It took 14 years, and that man was fired. That association went up in smoke, and he's gone. In the meantime, I went when that happened, and I told Zeke, I said, Zeke, guess what happened? And I told him what happened, and he just smiled. He never said a word, he just smiled. But that look there is something that, there's a lot of different things in my mind. I saw him look like that a lot over different situations. Not a great big grin, no. He just give you that and say a few words, and what he said he really meant. Thank you. And I'd like to thank Zeke on behalf of all the commercial fishermen in California for all he's done for us over the years. Thank you, Zeke.
Academy of Sciences for a while, and he's a professor emeritus, Cal Academy of Science. He's done incredible things for salmon, for sharks. He's a friend of Fidel Castro. I mean, he knows everybody. but he's very, very close to Zeke.
Thank you, Ed. I will be brief because we're running out of time and you have so many stories to share with each other. And I'll begin by just saying that, Lois, I am so honored by your invitation to add my comments as a scientist to the celebration of Zeke's life and career. We know that he was trusted by the members of the PCFFA, all fishermen, even when he suggested unpopular ideas such as seasonal closures, limits, even preserves that function as nursery grounds, when it resulted in sustainable fisheries. We also know that he was feared by politicians, many politicians, and most dam operators, Central Valley farmers, and anyone who valued financial gain at the expense of sustainable systems. And he did not suffer fools. In the case of science, he was respected and appreciated by the many scientists, such as Ed, who we all know, and who is typical of so many of us that have had a symbiotic relationship with Zeke and his knowledge. And I must say that the symbiosis was really benefiting us in science a little more than it even benefited him. I arrived in San Francisco in 1973 after having graduated from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Fortuitously, I moved to Sausalito, and even more serendipitously, I rented up Spring Street. I soon discovered Fred's restaurant just up the hill from Ocean Traders, and there I met Zeke, many fishermen, and learned how much I didn't know. As a sidebar, I should add that we were later advised by the Surgeon General to move our breakfast meetings to the Dipsy. But I'll say that I learned so much at those breakfast meetings. Why was Zeke so successful? Well, he was a combination of enormous energy, good humor, patience, and a great education that was provided him by his family. in his time spent on the water. Late 19th century zoologist Louis Agassiz of Harvard later told his students to study nature, not books. Zeke did so and graduated summa cum laude from his experiences. He really learned a lot by being on the water, and that's why scientists trusted him. And for the next 4 decades, we shared our views, new discoveries in science, and he explained to me the political and biological consequences of what otherwise seemed to be so simple to a scientist. I required that my graduate students call him, and colleagues as well, if they were going to be working on the water, and learn from his experience. He had time and took time to give them advice, directions about depths and locations and situations that were much more complex than we thought just by reading scientific journals and attending scientific meetings. He advised me on sharks. He advised me on rockfish, ecosystems, and in particular, the winter on Chinook salmon and all the complications associated with that when I took that project on. Much of my work would never have been possible without Zeke's advice and countenance. Lois, I'm going to end by paraphrasing what so many others have said to you already today, and that is that I speak for all of us, both directly and indirectly, be they the scientists, or the students, the fishermen, or the fishes, or the ecosystems, who have benefited from Zeke's life and career. And I thank you and your family for sharing him with us. Thank you very much.
Cook and Zeke Grader is a friend of mine. Lois and my wife Marla are cousins, and I don't know how common this is, but here's a situation where the husbands of cousins became very good friends. Because when we first met, we learned early on that we had a lot in common personally, professionally, we shared values and interests, and that long-term friendship was developed. As you heard from Sam Grader earlier, the Grader family has been recognized for decades in liberal democratic politics. The Cook family has been lesser recognized, but we've been involved in those same politics and many times with Zeke. Most important from my perspective, Zeke and I shared respect and engagement with the California legislature. We love the process. We're both legislative advocates. We love the institution, its characters, and trust me, they're characters. And most important, our role in that process. Now, Zeke was a consummate advocate. About 40 years ago, Zeke, Lois, my family, and I had dinner at a highly regarded restaurant in Berkeley. And after looking at the menu, Zeke noticed that they were serving fresh salmon. So he asked the server, "Do you really have fresh salmon tonight?" She said, "Oh, yes, we do." He said, "Well, it's interesting because if so, you're breaking the law. Salmon is out of season and you're operating illegally." The server assured Zeke that in fact the fish was fresh. So Zeke said, "Well, I want to talk with the chef." So we got up, escorted, and walked into the kitchen and lectured the chef on the meaning of fresh. Upon his return to the table, he announced that the word fresh was being removed from the menu, but he ordered the salmon. But also, while Zeke was educating the kitchen staff, Lois was entertaining our young sons by playing hide and seek on the restaurant floor. The interesting thing is that we weren't evicted from the restaurant, but as we were leaving, no one from the staff said, "Look forward to seeing you again soon." Now, many of you had the opportunity to experience the annual fishing industry legislative reception that Zeke put on for many years in Sacramento. It was one of the most highly anticipated events each year, and the turnout of legislators was extraordinary. Not only because the food was outstanding and for legislators it was free, but primarily because of the respect that legislators had for Zeke and because of him, the fishing industry. A little over a year ago, a client called to tell me they had some issues with an issue that Jared mentioned earlier, the Trinity River water flow. And they thought they had a legislative solution that they wanted me to work with them, with the California legislature. So we talked about the issue. I asked them specifically what their suggested solution was, and who they thought might oppose that. Well, they began the list, and when Zeke Grader's name came up, I said, look, you've got two choices. Forget about it, or call Zeke in and work on a compromise, because there is no one with greater respect on water issues in California than Zeke Grader. We will not beat him. Zeke was a passionate advocate for the fishing industry in the state capitol. He had an impact, and he made a difference. He was respected by legislators regardless of their party affiliation. They highly respected his experience and knowledge. They sought his counsel, not only on issues of importance to the fishing industry, but of issues facing the legislature and their potential impact on Zeke's personal interests. This is something that every lobbyist, I think, hopes to achieve, but unfortunately not many of us do. In closing, I'd like to share with you an excerpt from the California State Senate session of September 9th, during which time Zeke's efforts were memorialized by a bipartisan group of California state senators.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. I would like to be able to do an adjourn of memory, and I know that we are late this evening, but we have lost a great in California. Tim Sloan, Executive Director of the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen Association, said it best about Zeke Grader. You would probably not be eating a wild California salmon today if it were not for Mr. Grader. Born near the Canadian border in Washington, Zeke moved to the gorgeous Mendocino County coast, where he tirelessly worked the fishing docks, unloading the daily catch from the Great Pacific when he was a young man. For nearly 4 decades, Zeke served as the hardest working person in the commercial fishing business. He served as the executive director for the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen Association for 40 years. Zeke fought day and night to protect and preserve California's rivers, estuaries, and fisheries, and to restore the historic, thriving wild salmon stock that historically called California home. He was a familiar figure to many of us here in Sacramento and throughout the country and in Washington, working to support clean and plentiful rivers, abundant fish, and a thriving commercial fishing sector. A lawyer by training who wound up making the king salmon his primary client, Mr. Grader was a short, blonde, stocky man who loved good food, scally caps, vintage cars, and strolls on Northern California beaches, and, of course, his beloved Cocker Spaniel, Emily. And we have a special guest here with us today, Mr. Grader's nephew, who is an attorney with the Legislative Counsel's Office. Nate Grader is in the back and would respectfully ask for adjourn in memory of the California State Senate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator McGuire. And I think on this issue, Senator Nielsen.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, Mr. President, Zeke Grader is a legend in California history. A legend in the business community as well as in the environmental community. He was a true man, true to his convictions and to his values. My pleasure to work with Zeke on many things over many years, including the management plan for the Sacramento River, Senate Bill 1086, which was not just that, but was the formation of something in addition, the Sacramento Valley Conservation Forum. That forum is yet still around, and Zeke helped me with it. One time he told me that that forum had done more to save the salmon in the Sacramento River than anything that had ever been done. I don't know that that's too grandiose of an acknowledgement of a joint project that I worked on with Zeke Grader. But he was not what I call a fierce fighter, but a persistent fighter. And he did understand economic concerns. As he fought for the fishermen in the ocean, he still yet worried about the folks at the headlands of the water and all the way down the waterways. Zeke Grader was a gentleman. He ought to go on in history as one of the real treasures of the state of California. I mourn in his memory.
Thank you very much, Senator Nielsen. I just wanted to clarify that this adjourn in memory is also on behalf of Senators Wolk, Pavley, Leno, and McGuire. And I just wanted to clarify that. Senator Leno.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I do know it's late. I will be respectful of that and brief. Senator McGuire and Senator Nielsen have said it all, but I do want to express my sadness in the passing at a far too young age of Zeke Grader. We worked together, I think, for 3 years to set some trap limits on crab fishing boats because northern states fishing people would come to our waters because our season started a little earlier, and without limits they would take most of our crabs north and impact our marketplace. It took us about 8 years, but finally the idea got signed into law. He was a fierce conservationist, but a man of great honor and integrity, tireless energy, and bottom line, a very fine human being. I ask that you do send your condolences along with ours to his family, and that we remember him in this adjourned memory.
Thank you, Senator Leno. Senator Wolk.
Yes, thank you. I would just like to briefly add that Zeke was, he certainly understood the connections and the importance in terms of water for fish, but more than that, he understood the connections between the Sierra, the Delta, the Bay, and the coast and the coastal industry, fisheries industry, and he was a strong defender of the Delta, and we will miss him. Let's adjourn in his memory.
Great. Thank you, Senator Wolk.
Morning. My name is Tim Sloan, and for those of you who don't know me yet, I have the distinct and humbling honor of having been asked to succeed Zeke at the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations and the Institute for Fisheries Resources. Zeke dedicated a hero's portion of himself to those organizations because I think that he really believed that the fishing community and the fish on which it relies are vital natural and cultural resources, and that if we lose them, they could never be replaced. And I kind of feel a lot like Zeke was that way too. The leadership and the charisma that he brought to bear in advocating on behalf of the fleet and the fish really can't be replaced at our organizations. But he cut a pretty deep and clear path for us to follow. And I think that with some ingenuity, and maybe if I can get my hands on one of those fish hook tie clips, we might be able to find our way through and keep fighting for these fish and for the fishermen who depend on them. Back in September, I, along with Lois, Zeke's brother Sam, and his sister-in-law Marilyn, attended the State of the Estuary Conference. It's put on by the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. And as you all know, Zeke's advocacy work extended up into the Delta Estuary, which provides critical habitat for our migrating salmon that eventually make it to the ocean and hopefully onto your dinner plate. This year, Zeke was the recipient of the partnership's Jean Auer Award. It's an award given in memory of Ms. Auer, who was a beloved Bay Area environmentalist whose groundbreaking efforts were directed at particularly improving water management in California. The partnership presented Zeke with the award while he was still at Zen Hospice. And Lois is actually wearing it today, I believe. Lois, do you have the award on? No, I don't. Oh, well, you were supposed to model for us. In conjunction with that award, the partnership, along with Chris and Jerry Kay, produced a video that was shown at the conference. And it features Zeke in his own words, describing the importance of protecting our natural resources and instilling a sense of environmental stewardship in every citizen, whether they be young or old, as you will come to see. We'd like to show you that video now. It's an opportunity for y'all to see Zeke in his own words, maybe one last time. And I guess I'd recommend if you have any tissues, would be a good time to bring him out. Thanks.
Zeke Grader is the Executive Director Emeritus of the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations. During his more than 40-year career, Zeke has been a powerful influence in helping to bring together environmentalists, fishermen, businesses, educators to focus on restoring and protecting the San Francisco Bay Delta Estuary. And this year, Zeke is the recipient of the San Francisco Estuary Partnership's Jean Auer Environmental Award. Now, in his own words, we present Zeke Grader.
I'd grown up working in a fish house,
I had seen what had happened when restrictions were put on fishing. And not just so much restrictions, just what happened when something went wrong in the ecosystem. And all of a sudden people couldn't fish or there weren't any fish. And saying that, and also growing up in a political environment, our household, I think the three big things were fish, politics, and sports. I think largely because of my father's interest. I got to see a lot of his work in politics. He was active as a member of the California Democratic Council with people like Alan Cranston. He was the first aide for Clem Miller, watching him having worked on Point Reyes National Seashore. And that's when the district extended from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border. And so as a kid, getting to travel that and just seeing the beauty of that area and understanding and seeing the fishing ports in different places. Plus having had some very good biology courses, not that I was any great scientist, but understanding the concepts. When everybody else was memorizing genus names, we were understanding natural selection, evolution. It all sort of came together later on as, having these types of understandings. I think probably the big thing I've seen in the course of the last 40 years has been the working relationship that has developed between the fishing community, the conservation community, and even some in the business and farming community, looking ahead and understanding that we need to protect these resources. They're not just ours to squander, but there's something that we have to protect for future generations. There was understanding among the fishermen that they had to be actively engaged in protecting resources. Otherwise, they were going to continue to get hammered by regulations that would shut them down. They just couldn't go off and curse government authorities, but that they, in fact, had to be a big part of trying to protect these resources if they were going to hope to fish in the future. Likewise, I saw among the environmental community a recognition that there was a need to embrace this blue-collar community that relied on these resources, made for a powerful coalition, because not just was this a group of Californians trying to protect their viewshed, but here was also Californians trying to protect sustainable livelihoods. It proved to be powerful when in the early 70s, we could go back to Washington and argue this was not just about viewsheds, but also about protecting food and jobs. So we were building this history or tradition of working together between the fishing community and the environmental community. I look at my board and I think, my God, this is probably the best time I ever had to kind of step down, because I think of some of them as being very strong, and I have a lot of faith in them. I think the environmental community right now is going through some changes, and I witnessed in our early days some very good and strong leadership that if we had not had, we couldn't have done these things. I think where we have to be next, or where the environmentalists need to be, is becoming more diverse. We haven't done a real good job of that, and I think that's something they're going through, of trying to find this new leadership, and they do need to find it. I look back and I think of the industries that are in fact sustainable or can be, and by this I mean fishing, agriculture, timber. Those are three that I think need to be closely tied in, working with government, working with the enviros and others, because we need to ensure that we have those resources there for the future. And there's no reason why we can't if we carefully manage them. That's my big hope. I think the big priorities for the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary, and keep in mind it is all one big system from the rivers in the Sierra out to the Gulf of the Farallones, is that we keep in mind just what a precious resource this is, being the largest estuary on the west coast of the two Americas, and what it means as far as the resources that it generates. Our duty to, I think, particularly educate people on its value. And I've had board members such as Larry Collins basically giving a congressional subcommittee a tutorial in how estuaries work, which was a real learning lesson for people such as Congressman Tom McClintock, who was thinking that somehow our rivers were being diverted to the Pacific. And I can remember Larry giving them a lecture on how that water was not being wasted, but in fact it was critical to irrigating the crops that he harvested, which are the fish. We need to be learning this in our schools. We need to remind people continually that this is an estuary, this is an estuary, and what an estuary is. Because even among the environmental community, I still hear some forgetting to include the term estuary. And an estuary requires that mix of fresh and tidal flows to create this rich ecosystem that's so important to all of us. So I think, a lot of this is just education. Just continue teaching kids, whether they're 6 or 7 years old or in college or members of Congress, that this is something that we need to be able to pass down to future generations and how important it is for all of us